I'd really like to express my sincere thanks to Professor Sun-Min Kim, the Research Institute of Korea Studies, the Pony Jung Foundation, for inviting me to give this presentation and being able to travel all the way across the world, across the Pacific from the United States to Korea to be with you, and to talk about my newly published book, or recently published book, Border of Water and Ice, the Yalu River in Japan's Empire, Korea, Manchuria. Also grateful to Kim at RIKS for, as was just explained, doing the translation of the script that you'll be reading, and for handling many of the logistics that allowed me to make this long trip here to be with you all. So very nice to be here. So when I present this work to audiences who are English-speaking, non-Korean audiences, I usually begin with an introduction to the geography of the Yalu River. So I show them this map, which comes from my book. I kind of explain where the Yalu River is. I mean, for this audience, such an introduction is not necessary. I think everyone here knows where the Amnok or Yalu River is, but I'll start with it anyway. So the Yalu Amnok River is one of the major rivers of Northeast Asia. Historically and in the present, it forms the boundary, part of the boundary between northern Korea and China. It originates about 2,500 meters above sea level, right here. Baekdusan, Mount Baekdu, or Changbaishan as it's called in Chinese, and then flows approximately 800 kilometers westward into the Yellow Sea. Now, for many Westerners who are interested in this region, if they do an internet search, for things like Yalu River, Chinese-Korean boundary, these are the kind of images, especially these ones. We're familiar today with this idea of this region, this border region, as a site of surveillance, a place where the movements of people between China and North Korea are heavily controlled. However, there's another aspect to this border today. It is also a site of active trade and exchange. Besides kind of illicit border crossings or smuggling, there is also an active trade, legal trade across the river between China and North Korea. So this photograph here is one I took myself many years ago, traveled to the border between North Korea and China. And both these bridges were built originally by Japanese imperialists in this region. The one on the right that you can see part of is the older bridge. It was built and finished in 1911 and then destroyed by the Americans during the Korean War, or the American imperialists, as the North Koreans might call them, or the Chinese communists. The one on the left, the one I saw the cars going across. So this really captures the duality of this border as a place of both surveillance, but also exchange. A dynamic that was also true in the river's past. The period of the Yalu or Amnok River's history that I discuss is not the current day, but rather the early 20th century, when this was an imperial border for rapidly expanding Japanese empire. After the emergence of a new Western-style state in Japan following the 1868 Meiji Restoration, this river became part of a really important frontier from the perspective of Japanese imperialists. Following successive victories in the First Sino-Japanese War and then the Russo-Japanese War, Japan occupied Korea, as a history we're probably all familiar with, and annexed it as a colony in 1910. As a result, this river became part of Imperial Japan's longest and most important non-maritime border. It was strategically important as a site for not only securing control over the Korean peninsula, but also projecting imperial power further into northeast China, what historically referred to as Manchuria, Manchu. Of course, the Yalu River, from the perspective of the occupying Japanese, was also a source of significant existential anxiety and fear about what they called rebellious Koreans and other threats, real and imagined, that existed beyond the border. But as my presentation also highlights, the Yalu was also defined by its unruly nature as a river, as it froze, thawed, and flooded across different seasons in ways that challenged colonial rule. So yes, after 1910, Japan annexes Korea, and then in 1931, Japanese military forces occupy the entirety of northeast China, creating the following year the puppet state of Manchukuo, which existed until the end of World War II. Now, at this point, technically, Imperial Japan controls both sides of the border. But as my research highlights, officials in Manchukuo and in colonial Korea often bickered, fought, disagreed over how best to govern this boundary, which continued to function as a boundary. Korean and Chinese anti-Japanese rebels exploited gaps in this colonial security apparatus to launch raids. Smugglers evaded custom taxes imposed by colonial Korea and Manchukuo. And all through this, you still have this Yalu and its riparian environment, its river environment, posing its own challenges to imperial rule. But before I go any further, I want to talk a little bit about why I became interested in this subject in the first place. It was hardly imaginable that someone like me, a white American, would become interested in the early 20th century Yalu River. My first exposure to Asia really began when I was a Mormon missionary in South Korea in the years 2009 and 10. During that period, I was a missionary. I was actually based in Busan, the Busan area in the Gyeongsang-namdo, South Gyeongsang province. And that's obviously the opposite side of the peninsula from the Yalu River, the opposite side of Korea. But it was through my missionary experience that I became really interested in Korea and its history. And I was a history major even before I went to Korea, but I wanted to study medieval European history. Thankfully, the mission changed my plans. I decided to research Korea, but also became really interested in Korea and how Korea interacted historically with its neighbors like Japan and China. So I not only kept studying Korean, which I minored in, as Professor Kim mentioned, but I also learned Japanese and Chinese and lived for some time in Japan and China. When I was young, the place I grew up in the United States was Utah, the state of Utah, in the southern part of Utah. There's a lot of very beautiful national parks there. I don't know if you see this image right here. This is a photograph of Zion National Park. I grew up close to Zion National Park. I actually worked there when I started college for a couple summers, and I became really interested in environmental issues. So going into graduate school, my graduate studies at Stanford University, I was interested in a topic for my dissertation. It's really important to pick a good dissertation topic as a grad student. I was interested in something that would combine my interests in China, Japan, Korea, as well as the environment. And it was actually at Stanford, one of my sanbe, David Fedman, who has written an excellent book on forestry in colonial Korea. He suggested I study the Yalu River during the colonial period. And I thought that was a wonderful idea. And 10 years later, the book was done. So research for this book took me all across Asia. This map here, you see the red pins. These show all the locations where I went to archives or libraries to research materials for this project on the Yalu River. I'm certainly not the first historian to note the significance of this border, of this region, to Korean history or East Asian history. I point to fantastic scholarship by figures such as eminent Dr. Kim, who's looked at this border during the Joseon Dynasty. There's other scholars who've looked at aspects, including scholars affiliated with the Society for Environment Ecological History in Korea, who have looked at different aspects of the 20th century Yalu, including dam construction, things like that. But my book represents the first study in any language to comprehensively analyze this period of the Yalu's politics while foregrounding the decisive role of the seasonally changing river environment. I would like to introduce two key analytical concepts that undergird my work. One is liquid geographies. I use this term to describe how the Yalu is made up of these different flows. So you have flows of people, including smugglers, anti-Japanese guerrillas, imperial officials, as well as flows of non-human actors, water, ice, sediment, timber, fish. My argument is that Japanese colonial officials were really trying to channel and contain these flows of people, flows of water, ice, in ways that benefited their imperial project. Tried to channel these liquid geographies of the border in ways that helped their expansion, but were not always successful in doing so, and in fact ran into many challenges. But another key concept in my book is what I call seasonal border making. One important feature of the Yalu's liquid geographies was that they changed by the season. What was flowing water in the spring through autumn was ice on the river surface in the winter. So for Japanese imperialists, constructing bridges, dams, policing the movement of peoples and goods, all meant you had to deal with the winter ice, the summer floods, and the other aspects of the Yalu's seasonal geography. Yet, the history of this region and of Japanese empire in Korea and elsewhere has often been written without paying attention to things like climate, like weather, like seasons, even though these are frequently mentioned in the primary sources when I started doing the research for this project. So the rest of my presentation follows an explicitly seasonal structure. I hope it's easy enough for us to follow along with. We'll be going from spring, summer, autumn, winter. I also have this chronological narrative that corresponds with this seasonal structure. So I show how key moments in time influence how imperial officials perceive and police this border. So following the March 1st and May 4th movements of 1919, the spring and especially summer were considered the most dangerous, anxious times for border security. Whereas following the Manchurian incident, a lot of this anxiety really shifts to the winter. So thinking across this history in different time scales, so not just years and decades, which most historians are more comfortable with. We like to think in years and decades most of the time, or centuries. But also be thinking about seasons and how the seasons matter to history. Because I argue that in thinking about this history across seasons, we get a better glimpse at the limits of state power in this region and how everyday life and border surveillance worked. So this presentation especially focuses on the third chapter of my book, where I examine how imperial officials tried to police the movements of so-called, what they called, their term, bandits, or anti-Japanese guerrillas, Bizok. As I argue, any attempt to understand Yalu border politics must begin with its seasonal patterns of water and ice. So, as described by Japanese policeman Matsuoka Shuji, the most cheerful time for border police in the colonial period was not New Year's, or Japanese New Year's, Shogatsu, or the summer holiday of Obon, which are typically the most prominent holidays in the Japanese calendar. Rather, it was the brief festival-like period at the beginning of the spring, known locally as the Hibingi, the thawing season, the thawing period, you could also translate it, when floating chunks of ice stopped the movements of so-called bandits across the border. So from the period when Japan dissolved the Korean army in 1907 until shortly after the annexation of the peninsula in 1910, Korean anti-Japanese fighters, known as Wibyung righteous armies, battled imperial troops throughout the peninsula. But by the early 19-teens, most of that had been pretty gone underground due to harsh suppression, and then there was this period of tense peace. But in the spring of 1919, as we all know, a series of events happens that changes this landscape. Simmering dissatisfaction with Japan's harsh colonial rule in Korea led to the 1919 March 1st Korean independence movement, which I'm sure the Samyeol-undong that we're all familiar with. By the end of this month, the protests that started in Seoul had spread throughout the peninsula. And what I find interesting is that, as you can see from even the language of the Declaration of Independence that Chae Nam-sun drafted, we have the language of seasons, of seasonal metaphors. And I'll give this translation in English of this passage, which is really well known. A new spring has arrived, prompting the myriad forms of life to come to life again. The past was a time of freezing and snow, stifling the breath of life. The present is a time of mild breezes and warm sunshine, reinvigorating the spirit. Of course, as we know, in response to this nonviolent protest, the Japanese unleashed a brutal wave of violence. And while the March 1st movements themselves was mostly nonviolent, this did help inspire an armed resistance movement, which took place near the Yalu River. So many of these anti-Japanese activists leave the peninsula and go camp along the border with Manchuria and launch raids against Japanese outposts across the river. In China during that same year, the May 4th movement grew out of student protests that took place in Beijing in May 4th, 1919. Much like the March 1st movement, you have these demonstrations spark nationwide protests. This was also a nationalist movement, also an anti-Japanese in many aspects. And it led many Chinese to also be more sympathetic to the Korean resistance movement against the Japanese. So after 1919, every spring now not only brings the thawing of the river, but also the anniversary of these events, these movements I just mentioned, and their explosive memory. And with this thawing of the ice and these anniversaries came this need to patrol river traffic for activity by a reinvigorated Korean resistance movement. Like I mentioned, many Korean independence activists moved north of Yalu and began waging an armed Hangul-undong. So here we have this image on the left, a postcard here of some of this boat track, what it looked like. But surveying from the Japanese official perspective, trying to clamp down on this boat traffic was more difficult by the fact that Yalu was this strategic conduit between Korea and Manchuria. There was a lot of trade on this border. What the Japanese needed for their economic interests, they want commerce to flow, but also made it more difficult to maintain what I call the selectively permeable membrane of the border. They want some things to be able to go across, but they want other things to not, right? So among the different boats that plied the colonial Yalu, you have these, what the Japanese call the propeller-fune, the propeller boats. So they're shallow-bottomed boats because the Yalu River is a pretty shallow river for much of its course. So these boats, by being built like that, they could go all the way upstream near Mount Baekdu. And these were subsidized in part by the Japanese colonial government. They were used to transport gold, mail, and provide passenger service. So they're really important for border administration, for the colonial economy, but that also made them really ripe targets for attack. This became really clear in 1924 when this guy here, Saito Makoto, he was the governor general of Korea at the time. In spring of 1924, he's on one of these propeller boats and he's traveling upstream on an inspection tour when a group of Korean independence fighters led by Baek Hwa-un, they fire on him from the Chinese side of the river. So he survived. He didn't die. But many colonial nationalists, Korean nationalists, were very excited by this attack. The Dongnip Shimun, the newspaper published by the provisional government in exile in Shanghai, lauded this attack and talked about how the governor general lost his senses and snuck away like a rat. And the fallout over this assassination attempt inflamed Sino-Japanese tensions. Japanese officials blamed the Chinese for allowing this attack to happen. In the wake of the assassination attempt, Wang Yubin, he was chief of the Chinese county of Jian, where the attack had taken place. He actually doesn't apologize. The Japanese want him to apologize. He doesn't apologize. In fact, he claims that the Japanese had made the whole thing up as an excuse to just send their police across the border. Now we're going to move to the summer, which prompted significant anxiety among border officials. So officials referred to this summer as the flourishing season, a time when there's more vegetation cover on the banks of the Yalu, so there's more places to hide, more things to eat. The availability of food and places to hide is especially important for anti-Japanese fighters who live this precarious existence between periodic raids and trying to avoid capture and death at the hands of Japanese authorities. Of course, another challenge of this particular season was the Changma, the monsoonal rains that brought heavy floods to the Yalu region. So from June to August, you have higher levels of precipitation than any other time of the year. And that could be, from border police perspective, very dangerous. On August 27, 1921, there was 4 Japanese colonial policemen. They're riding a raft. So here they have canoes In this case, they're riding a raft when rising waters caused the raft to overturn and drowning one of the policemen when he couldn't swim out. Of course, anti-Japanese guerrillas and people who lived along the border were just as vulnerable, if not more vulnerable, to the dangers of Yalu flooding. But in the sources at the time, there was a real emphasis on the bandits and how they might use the floods to launch attacks and cause chaos. Who or what to blame? What was to blame for these massive floods? Was this just a natural occurrence, just something that happened because of the summertime, you get more rain and thus more floods? For Japanese colonial officials, there was an answer, and that was hwajanmin, like fire-filled farmers, we might call them, slash and burn agriculturalists. People who went up into the mountains and burned forests to farm because they didn't have other options. They were economically marginalized in colonial Korea with few other places to go. They lived this hardscrabble existence. But from the perspective of Japanese colonial officials, who in this picture on the left, this illustration, I should say, he's berating this hwajanmin family, telling them to go away, stop burning state forests. They blame this way of life for destroying forests and then causing more erosion and flooding. And I would say their role is not insignificant, but I think their role of these hwajanmin in particular pales compared to what Japanese industries were doing and massive logging operations along the upper Yalu, which, as more trees were cut down along the forests of the upper Yalu, near like Mount Baekdu, more dirt, soils washed into waters, caused more erosion, flooding got worse. In 1935, Yoon Chi-ho, probably heard of before, he's writing in his diary, which he keeps in English. He's heard news about Yalu flooding, and he says, the conscienceless and heartless cutting down of the forests on the mountains from which the Yalu receives its mighty volume of water must be largely responsible for this fearful flood. And even he, in Faraway Seoul, I think, understood a phenomena that was happening. So flooding and other factors combined to make the summer the most challenging time in the eyes of border officials during this period of the 1920s. And even the statistics I've compiled shows the sort of greater number of incidents during this period. So this summertime seasonal violence affected women as well as men. So I don't want to make it clear that the story isn't just about men. Unsurprisingly, the many women affected by seasonal cross-border violence, those that received the greatest sympathy from Japanese sources were Japanese women, the ethnically Japanese wives of border policemen. On August 29, 1925, Korean guerrillas attacked a Japanese police station in the border town of Yangsan, killing the wife of one police officer and the wife and adopted mother of another. These dramatic deaths captivated the Japanese popular imagination. So this image on the left is from a 1929 article in a Japanese magazine, Kingu, which tells the story of one police wife, Kyoko, who she worked in a factory in Kyoto. She's a textile worker, but she marries her husband, who becomes a policeman in colonial Korea along the border. And when the husband's out, her station is attacked. And the article explains how her upbringing gave her all this courage and tenacity, and she took up one of her husband's handguns and shot it before being fired. Of course, the article also notes that originally Kyoko was supposed to go back to Japan for a family event, but had said she wouldn't because it was summertime. And she knew that summer was the most dangerous time, so according to this article, she wanted to stay until it was over to help her husband. So stories like this circulate in Japan, but of course want to emphasize is that border violence had an especially disproportionate effect on local Korean and Chinese women. This image on the right comes from a short story from the colonial period about Korean women who have to smuggle salt and other goods across the Yalu River out of desperation while trying to avoid the gaze of colonial officials. In 1924, the Ilbo ran some articles accusing Japanese and ethnically Korean policemen in Ganggae County in Pyeongbuk-do of raping local Korean women under the pretense of hunting for bandits. And then when the same women tried to appeal to other officials, they were threatened by the police for reporting these crimes. So after long summers of searing temperatures, high humidity, riverside raids, and these diplomatic tensions, the general consensus among Japanese border officials about the Yalu Autumn was that it was too short, far too brief. According to one police officer, Yamada Inosuke, he said, "It is usually said that a single falling leaf heralds the coming of autumn. But the northern borders of Korea, that doesn't apply. If a single leaf falls, then winter is known to be coming." Discussion of the autumn in a border security context tended to focus on getting ready for the winter, what they called the icebound season, which included commandeering local Koreans to help build, like you see that watchtower there, or the fences, the barbed wire. So this is what a police station would have looked like along the upper Yalu River. So you see the mountains there, it's very remote. And so they took over, you see the Hanok building, they basically took over a Korean building, a house, and then added these other features using commandeered corvée labor to make it like a little fortress. And a lot of that work took place in the autumn. But then in September of 1931, there's a key event that changes the politics of the border. At 10 a.m., September 18th, 1931, Japanese army officials with the Kwangdong Army station in Manchuria stage a railway explosion, blame it on the Chinese, and then use that as an excuse to take over all of northeast China. So the Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek doesn't resist, but many Chinese want to. And then the Chinese Communist Party is especially active in helping organize resistance to the Japanese takeover. And much of this violence has direct effects on this border, which became an important front line for many officials. And the chaos of the border violence became especially pronounced from the eyes of officials during the wintertime. So typically, winter in this area was referred to as the Gyeolbingi, the icebound season. This was the time when the most important thing about living in that space was that the river was frozen over. Thick ice covered the Yalu surface for almost a third of the year, so about 4 months or so. And the freezing of the river, this has multiple meanings and uses. For Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans working in the Yalu timber industry, so they're cutting down trees, this is a time when you usually do most of your work in terms of cutting down trees, and then you move logs on the frozen earth to close by the river, where when the river melts, then you can float them downstream. The frozen river is also a place to ice skate. Koreans are really good at speed skating. People back then were good at speed skating too on the frozen river. But all this changes, of course. After the Manchurian incident, you have a number of key attacks by anti-Japanese guerrillas that take place during the winter that cause officials to be really concerned about the icebound season. What they see is that there's this river between Korea and Manchuria that's kind of like a moat. It's hard to cross, but suddenly when it freezes over, of course, it's much easier to cross for anyone to cross. So they're worried about attacks taking place by guerrillas based in Manchuria coming into Korea. So summer was, as I showed, statistically most deadly time for colonial officials in the 1920s. By the 30s, over half of so-called bandit invasions took place during the winter. There was the text is hard to see, but there's 3 particular incidents between 1934 and 1936 that happened in the winter. They were very large scale. The Tosung incident, Tongyong incident, the Taegil. The Tongyong incident in 1935. The leader of that attack in the winter of 1935 was Lee Hong-kwang, this guy. But some people at the time thought he was a woman, and it was reported that there was a female leader of this guerrillas. But that wasn't actually the case. There was female members of his guerrilla group, which might have led to that misconception. So the effects of official concerns about the wintertime border and the frozen river being especially inviting for guerrillas to cross and thus attack colonial outposts, this manifested in terms of practical policy, so how border security happens. And I have here a quote from, I hope I don't get in trouble for sharing the Bukwe leader here, Kim Il-sung. But here is guerrilla leader, he later president of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, in his autobiography, he claims that, as he says here, that the Japanese were so afraid of him and other guerrillas crossing the frozen river that they would literally drag people out to like break the ice up. And here he says, oh, isn't like how stupid they were, how much they must have scared of our attacks to have done such a stupid, childish measure. I think this story is exaggerated. I have done research. I don't think the Japanese were actually rounding people up to break holes in the ice, because wouldn't it just refreeze? That doesn't even really make sense. But exaggerated as Kim's story might be, these anxieties, the fears of colonial officials about guerrillas crossing this frozen border were real. So winter was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, Japanese in Manchuria would often use the winter to their advantage by trying to crush guerrilla resistance. As one former Japanese soldier recalled in an oral testimony, an oral history, he's like, well, we did it in the winter because you could track footprints in the snow. Like it was easier to hunt people down in hiding. There's fewer places to hide. People are cold, it's hard. But at the same time, colonial officials are also afraid that, like I mentioned, that retreating Manchurian guerrillas might cross the frozen river into Korea. It's hard to see, but there's two Korean individuals here. The policeman's interrogating them, or there's also a police officer here, can't see. But there's a sign, and I tried to read the text, and the text is in Japanese. And what I could parse out, it says, rules for travels on ice. Border crossings outside of designated areas, strictly forbidden. Travel outside of designated times, strictly forbidden. Travel at night. For most years during the period in the 1930s, during the winter, Japanese officials would station more police along the border, move them from other parts of Korea to the border. But in addition to putting more boots on the ground in terms of colonial police, wintertime policing the yellow border also involved mobilizing young Korean people, young men who were organized in what were called 자경단, self-defense corps. By February 1938, total membership in the self-defense corps was over almost 17,000. This is 7 times the number of actual police on the border. So most of the people doing the work of patrolling the frozen border are people like you see here. Young Korean men, rounded up and told, you can tell. Do you see any smiles? Nah, you don't see any smiles. They're not terribly excited. You can tell, because they're going to have to go out at night when it's freezing on the frozen river. They don't have guns. The Japanese don't trust them with guns. They just have sticks, and they're going to go do patrol. Japanese observers wrote admiringly about them, say, oh, they're so loyal to the empire. But one Korean who grew up in Sakju near the Yalu border, he wrote later in a memoir about how he was called up every evening to keep guard, and if he heard the sound of a barking dog or something similar across the frozen ice, we had to stare and watch the intensity that pierced the frozen darkness. And many times these self-defense corps members paid the price for their participation, probably unwilling, but still participation in the colonial security apparatus, such as in March 1936, the Tegu raid, when a Korean villager, Pakilok, was killed by a guerrilla bullet. By the 1930s, the Japanese are also using popular media, magazines like the Asahi Grafu, films, things like that, radio broadcasts to try to get more support for winter border security, highlighting how winter's hard, it's cold, and these guerrillas, they're so tricky and they might cross the frozen river, but our police are doing everything they can. They also took pains to highlight, like you see here, the role of border police wives in kind of protecting the warmth of official homes, both literally and metaphorically. But what these sources don't often talk about are people like this woman here. Do you see this image? So you have, this is obviously wintertime. Look how thickly they're bundled up. Here are the police at one station. And here are two of the police wives. This woman is obviously wearing kimono. She's Japanese, whereas this woman is wearing hanbok. Korean language media at the time didn't really want to talk about them, rather talk about victims of colonial security. But we do get images like this that survive to this day. So in this presentation, I didn't talk that much about smuggling, but smuggling is a major part of chapter 4 of my book. And it was very active during the Yalu winter. So in the Tohang Ilbo in 1933, one reporter put it this way. They said, smugglers wait for the river to freeze as eagerly as Christians wait for the coming of their Redeemer. Which I think is maybe a bit of hyperbole, but it is true that a lot of smuggling happened during the winter. It was much easier to move goods across the frozen river and evade detection. And even after 1931, when Manchukuo and colonial Korea exist, there's a lot of smuggling between those two areas, and would sometimes lead those officials to butt heads with each other. But by the early 1940s, as we go into World War II, the Asia-Pacific War, there were some changes that were happening that were changing the way these liquid geographies took shape. The Supung Dam. This was a major project built between 1937 and 1944. It was built to provide electricity for Japanese plants in Korea and Manchuria and fuel its wartime empire. When finished, it was the second largest dam in the world. But as the engineers are trying to build this, they discover that it's difficult to build a huge dam like this on such a powerful, seasonally changing river. Floods in the summer ended up delaying the project by 2 years. But once completed, it changed Yalu season patterns in dramatic ways. Once completed, the river below the dam no longer froze over in the winter. It was also during this period, smuggling continues to be a problem, but the Japanese very brutally are suppressing the guerrilla movement. So it seemed by the 1940s that bandits were done. But all this ambition to kind of change the river in really dramatic ways. The Japanese said they were going to build 7 dams on the river. They only built 1. All this, of course, collapses in 1945 with the defeat of Japan in World War II. But after the Japanese surrender and depart, the various new states that emerge and Cold War empires continue to vie for control in this region and continue to grapple with the Yalu's liquid geographies, which continues to shape the politics of the border. During, of course, the Korean War, American and South Korean troops march nearly to the river's frozen edge, where, according to a New York Times article, the early winter caused more trouble to our troops than did enemy action. And then here is a very famous image from the Korean War of Chinese troops crossing the Yalu to go into North Korea to support the North Koreans. And something you notice about this image is they're using a bridge here. Like, the river's not frozen over, even though it's in the dead of winter. This is February. Even today, you can see here on the right, the Yalu border remains a heavily policed and militarized contact zone between China and North Korea. At the same time, the movement of peoples and goods, legal, illegal, continues to thrive in this seasonally changing space. Disastrous floods caused by deforestation are still happening, resulting in evacuations. We also hear stories about like Tarbukta who crossed the frozen river to make their way into China. So as my research shows, trying to understand the history of spaces like the Yalu, these border regions, means grappling with their environmental as well as social dynamics, understanding these liquid geographies and the state efforts to channel and contain them, and how these change across time in different seasons. To border officials, the Yalu was not one border, but many. An all too unreliable moat in the spring through fall and a subversive ice bridge in the winter. And then uncovering these seasonal contingencies help us understand the lived experience and mentalities of state surveillance and power in these regions. So this will hopefully give you a sense. This is my book, has 5 chapters. Most of what I talked about today comes from chapter 3, Seasons of Yalu River Border Policing. I touched on smuggling a tiny bit and talked a little bit about dam as well. But here are different aspects. of my project. I welcome any questions about any aspect of the book when we go into the Q&A. Thank you all for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to your later questions and comments.